She destroyed $8,000 of wine in front of Chicago's deadliest mafia boss, and then she rolled her eyes at him. If you dropped a tray of vintage Burgundy on Dante Varley's table, you'd be begging for your life. But broke waitress Aria Bennett just told the city's most feared crime lord to hurry up and threaten her because she had other tables to serve. What happened next didn't get her killed. It made the monster obsessed.
The crystal shattered against the marble, a violent crack that assassinated the hum of Chicago's elite dining room. You and I must look closely at this frame, because this is where the tragedy takes its first breath. Aria Bennett stood frozen, ruined glass glittering around her shoes like diamonds drowning in blood. Across the shattered room sat Dante Varley, a kingpin who carved his empire from pure fear. The dim light caught the predatory angle of his jaw as he deliberately lowered his linen napkin. Their eyes collided. Any other soul would have wept for mercy. Instead, Aria simply rolled her exhausted eyes. It is a quiet truth of human nature. Sometimes, when we have absolutely nothing left to lose, complete apathy becomes our most impenetrable armor. The riverbend was a sanctuary of shadows and wealth, where absolute silence functioned as current aesthetic, and a misplaced footstep felt like a crime. Aria had been trapped in this gilded cage for 3 months, yet her hands still trembled every night she tied her black apron. The heavy silver tray shook against her palm as she balanced 4 delicate crystal glasses, each worth more than her rent. The patrons at table 7 demanded the 2015 Burgundy, a vintage so rare it required 2 managers to break the seal. She closed her tired eyes for a fraction of a second. "You can do this," she whispered to the empty hallway. We all whisper these little lies to ourselves in the dark, hoping courage will follow. But false bravery rarely stops an inevitable disaster. It was a fragile habit of survival, a quiet prayer her mother could never scold out of her. Aria begged her racing heart to slow down. She tried to ignore the suffocating heat, tried not to feel the exact sickening moment her shoes snagged on a slightly elevated brass floor tile. The heavy silver tray tilted. Time itself seemed to drown in molasses, dragging out the agony as she watched her entire livelihood slide toward the abyss. The impossibly thin crystal tumbled through the warm chandelier light, beautiful for one heartbreaking second before violently detonating against the marble. The crash entirely murdered the room's manufactured peace. Life forces us to learn a brutal truth. We can walk carefully for years, but one uneven step can still bring us crashing down to our knees. Every head in the velvet-draped room snapped toward the sound. Aria dropped to her knees, trembling hands hovering over an expanding pool of dark vintage wine that looked terrifyingly like a fresh hemorrhage. As she lifted her chin, she locked eyes with Dante Varley. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone in Chicago knew the monster hiding behind the bespoke suits and the hollow title of a businessman. A dark reputation is a heavy anchor, and it inevitably drags everyone in its orbit into the deep. He sat in the furthest corner booth, bathed in shadow, his back to the wall, so he could watch every exit. 3 massive enforcers flanked him like stone gargoyles, their eyes completely empty, stripped of all human mercy by the terrible things they had done in his name. The bodyguards wore coats that failed to hide the heavy lines of their concealed weapons, their hollow eyes scanning the frightened diners. But the true gravity belonged to Dante. He was not the deformed beast our stories warn us about. His face was a tragic masterpiece, a profile struck on an ancient blood-stained coin. His jaw was locked tight, his mouth a cruel line. He wore his charcoal suit like armor, and his suffocating gaze was fixed entirely on Aria. The restaurant stopped breathing. Somewhere, a kitchen timer shrieked like a dying bird, completely ignored. In that terror, Arya desperately clung to her waitress training. It reminds us that when pure panic floods our veins, simple, predictable routine is the only raft we have left to keep from drowning in the dark. Driven by instinct, Arya dropped a white cloth over the crimson puddle, hands trembling to erase the mess. "I am so sorry," she whispered to the marble, her pride shattering with the glass. Then, the terrified voice of her manager, Robert, cut through the air. You could almost hear his 15 years of ambition snapping in his throat. He was a man built on perfect order, terrified by the silent presence of a predator like Dante. "Miss Bennet, stand up." She rose slowly, clutching the wine-soaked linen to her chest like a bleeding flag of surrender. The dark stain soaked her uniform, branding her. The most painful part of any mistake isn't the physical damage, but having to wear the visible scars of our deepest failures in front of a cold, watching world. The dark wine spread across her stomach, painting a tragic picture of a fatal wound. Her cheeks burned as Robert glared at her, his eyes holding absolute venom. "My office," he hissed. "We will discuss this post-service." In the brutal theater of fine dining, those words were a death sentence. Arya prepared to beg for her livelihood, but before she could speak, a dark, velvet voice sliced through the room. "Actually, I require a dialogue with her first." Dante stood up, moving with the terrifying, unhurried grace of a panther stepping out of the brush. Robert trembled, the blood draining from his face. "That is unnecessary, sir," he choked out. Dante didn't even blink. "I am not asking. It is a chilling reminder that true, absolute power never has to raise its voice to bring a room to its knees. Let's pause and look at this together, you and I." Those 4 words completely severed the manager's authority. Robert's mouth clicked shut, his free will crushed by the sheer weight of Dante's dark presence. Dante stopped just inches from Arya, invading her space. Up close, the tragic roadmap of his violent life was clear. The pale scar slicing his brow, the terrifying abyss of his eyes, the danger coiled in his jaw. Every instinct screamed at Arya to lower her head. But poverty creates a specific kind of exhaustion, and she was simply too tired to be terrified. "If you intend to threaten me, accelerate the process," she said, staring right back. "I have tables waiting." It reveals a profound truth. Endless hardship eventually burns away our fear, leaving only a reckless courage in its wake. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack ribs. One of Dante's enforcers stepped forward, a mountain of violence ready to strike. Dante barely lifted 2 fingers, and the giant froze instantly. "What is your name?" Dante asked, his voice terrifyingly flat. "You already know," Arya fired back. "You heard my manager." The air grew colder. "I need to hear it from your own mouth." Like a tragic heroine, she locked eyes with him. Looking into his gaze was exactly like staring down the dark barrel of a loaded gun. "Arya Bennet," she breathed. He tasted the syllables slowly, letting her name linger on his tongue. "Do you enjoy this employment?" Behind her, someone let out a strangled gasp. It is a vital lesson in survival, in the ruthless games of power. A softly spoken question can be far more dangerous than a drawn blade. The strangled noise was undoubtedly Robert, likely on the edge of a heart attack. But then the terrifying mask of Dante's face fractured for a second, revealing a ghost of genuine amusement. "Most people cower when I stand before them," he noted with dark curiosity. "Most people have things worth losing," she snapped back. Her mother always warned that her sharp tongue would be the death of her, and standing before this kingpin, it felt like a prophecy. Shifted his shoulders, studying her like a broken puzzle. "You aren't afraid of me. I am absolutely terrified, she whispered, but I am also financially ruined, so I simply don't have the energy left to beg. Life teaches us that sometimes stripping away our walls and offering brutal, naked honesty is the only way to disarm the monsters standing in our path. Miss Bennet, Robert choked out, his voice snapping under sheer terror. Dante raised one hand, silencing the manager with the effortless dominance of a king. What is the price of the spilled wine? He asked softly. Aria's heart hammered as she looked at the puddle. More than I make in 3 months, she admitted. $4,000, Robert whimpered. A bottle. She had dropped too. A suffocating despair washed over Aria as the weight of an $8,000 mistake buried her. Dante never broke eye contact with her. Put the penalty on my tab, he commanded smoothly. The dining room exhaled in unison, and Robert began babbling his pathetic gratitude. But we must always beware of sudden saviors. A favor from a dangerous man is never a rescue. It is simply a velvet collar being securely fastened around your neck. I will take dinner in the private wing, Dante stated, leaving no room for debate, and she will serve me. Robert frantically stepped in. Sir, protocol states. Dante shifted his dark eyes, and the unspoken threat severed the manager's words like a guillotine. Survival defeated policy. Yes, Mr. Varley. Robert swallowed. Dante turned back to Aria, his gaze lingering like she was a fascinating new obsession. You have 4 minutes, he murmured. Do not keep me waiting. He turned, his guards falling into orbit around him as they vanished into the corridor. Aria stood perfectly still amidst the broken glass. Robert grabbed her arm, fingers digging into her skin. What in God's name was that? He hissed. You and I know exactly what it was. Life teaches us that when a predator specifically invites you into his den, your old life is already over. We have all seen a mind shut down under sheer terror. Robert leans in, his voice a venomous whisper. You possess no data? He hisses. You spoke to the apex predator of this city as if he were a customer unhappy with his meal. Aria stares back, completely hollowed out. My nervous system panicked, she breathes. Robert shuts his eyes, forcing a deep breath. Get a fresh uniform, he orders. Keep your eyes on the floor, remain mute, and vanish instantly. Understand? Aria grips the counter, trembling. What is his ultimate objective? Robert steps back, rigid. I remain completely ignorant, and I prefer it that way. If you trigger his hostility, no one can shield you. It leaves us with a stark life lesson. Panic is a fatal luxury when you are standing in the shadow of a true monster. The camera follows Aria up the shadowed staircase, the silence pressing in like a physical weight. The private dining room functions as a flawless isolation chamber. Her heart hammers violently against her ribs. She smooths her apron, the unconscious behavior of prey trying to placate a threat. Inside, Dante sits bathed in the cold light of the Chicago skyline. He faces the door directly, a quiet masterclass in spatial dominance. His guards are absent, a calculated move to lower her defenses. Aria freezes at the threshold, caught in a war between her screaming instinct to flee and the gravity of his command. The lesson here is absolute and unforgiving. When your gut begs you to run from a quiet room, you must turn around before the heavy door finally clicks shut behind you. Watch closely how the trap actually springs. It begins with quiet commands. Close the door, bring the plate, take a seat. This is the dark art of breaking a human spirit. As Aria pushes the heavy oak door shut, the metallic click of the latch echoes like a closing vault. Her hands tremble violently, betraying her absolute terror. When Dante commands her to sit, he shatters the fragile glass of her professional safety. She clings desperately to the role of a simple waitress, but he tears that script away. By demanding she speak his given name, he forces an artificial intimacy, planting the terrible seeds of a trauma bond. Here is a profound lesson. Yielding to small, politely phrased demands is often the exact mechanism that finally locks us inside our own psychological cages. The camera slowly closes in on Dante's unblinking eyes. He drops a veiled threat onto the table, his predatory stare locking her in place. Then he softly pivots, feeding her the intoxicating lie of exceptionalism. He tells her she is utterly unique, weaving a dark tale of his own cursed grandeur. He paints himself as a man whom society only ever uses or fears. When Aria hides behind the excuse of simple ignorance, Dante pulls back the heavy curtain. He allowed her mistakes simply to study her panic. To a casual observer, this looks like pure madness. In truth, it is a cold, calculated test of her boundaries. Never forget this piece of quiet wisdom. The people who silently study our flaws are rarely seeking a warm connection. They are merely measuring the exact pressure needed to break us. See how the crystal glass and dark wine become instruments of pure terror. He demands her secrets while offering nothing in return, letting the crushing weight of his status pin her down. Exhausted and shaking, and Aria's mental shields finally shatter. She bleeds her pain onto the table, confessing she is merely a failed artist. She tears herself down, a desperate plea to make herself entirely uninteresting to this wolf. Dante simply smiles and turns the knife. By whispering that he truly sees her, he strikes the exact center of her lifelong loneliness. Her trembling fear is flawlessly correct. It leaves us with a bitter, necessary truth. Never hand your deepest insecurities to a person holding all the power, because they will eagerly forge your pain into the chains they use to keep you. The ambient hum of the city fades as Dante lowers his voice, crafting a flawless illusion of vulnerability. He stares into his glass, confessing to 12 years of emotional deadness. He lists the terror he inspires, painting himself as a tragic, lonely god. Then he drops the ultimate snare. He claims Aria's quiet indifference was the sole force capable of piercing his dark armor. It is a terrifyingly elegant manipulation. By crowning her as his sudden savior, he drops an unbearable psychological weight onto her shoulders. Aria freezes, entirely unable to navigate this mask of broken humanity. Let this serve as a warning in the dark. When a wolf suddenly drops to its knees to show you a bleeding wound, it is always a calculated trap built to consume your precious empathy. Let us look at this next move together. Dante steps away to the massive glass window. This blocking creates a sudden physical vacuum, silently forcing Arsia to emotionally lean toward his towering silhouette against the lonely skyline. He demands one real truth from her, claiming his world is built on lies. This is the dark poetry of capturing a soul. He extracts her deeply buried trauma, forging an artificial bond. Even as her intuition begs her to sprint for the door, the velvet snare pulls tight. Aria tearfully hands over her most agonizing fear, the terror of fading away unnoticed. We must learn from this tragic mistake today.
Real human intimacy demands a foundation of safety.
A forced confession inside a gilded cage only ever hands a smiling warden the master keys to your mind. Dante whispers that he truly sees her. This dark validation is the exact drug her shattered esteem craves, rapidly cementing the trauma bond. She stammers, overwhelmed by the crushing gravity of the moment. Suddenly, a sharp phone ring shatters the heavy air. In a terrifying flash of psychological switching, the broken man vanishes. His spine goes rigid, and the cold, untouchable apex predator steps back into the light. He turns to leave, but make sure the suffocating tension remains unresolved. By casually stating that they are not finished, he plants a toxic seed of paralyzing dread directly in her chest. The steel teeth of the trap have finally snapped shut. The lesson here is written in cold blood. Never mistake the quiet, calculating stillness of a hunting wolf for a moment of genuine, lasting peace. Today, you and I will unpack this tragic descent together. It began in a quiet room where the very syllables of Dante Varelli's name felt like ash on Aria's tongue. It was a screaming intuition she tragically ignored. She tried to hold the line, stating that seeing him again was a mistake. Dante simply offered a hauntingly perfect, calculated smile. A predator wearing a flawless mask of warmth. When the door finally closed behind him, Aria stood paralyzed, her pulse battered against her throat. Her body recognized the monster her mind was trying to rationalize. She remained in the silence, entirely unaware she was being pulled into a violent labyrinth of men who feel nothing. The truth is universally chilling. We often walk straight past the brightest red flags simply because the darkness smiles so beautifully. The camera blurs as her shift dissolves into pure dissociation. Her manager avoids her, sensing the dark shadow Dante left behind. The $500 tip is not generosity. It is financial grooming, a down payment on her surrender. She rides the midnight train, trapped in cognitive dissonance, obsessing over his claim that his heart had been dead for 12 years. Her cramped apartment offers only a thin illusion of sanctuary. The freezing draft and clanking radiator are her only anchors. At 2 a.m, her terror erupts onto a blank canvas, frantically painting the dread she cannot voice. It reveals a heartbreaking reality of our human nature. When we are terrified and unable to scream, our minds will always find a chaotic, desperate way to bleed the panic out into the world. Swallowed by intense derealization, she sits on her bed, forcing down a cheap meal to remind her body it is alive. She tries to convince herself the encounter was just a nightmare. Then, her phone lights up the dark. An unknown number. Dante tells her it is not over. A healthy soul would have instantly blocked the contact to survive. Instead, the roots of Stockholm Syndrome take hold. She engages with him, asking how he found her. Dante's reply is a chilling display of godlike omnipotence. He recites her entire biography, from her birth in Indianapolis to her Chicago doorstep, systematically ripping away her privacy to establish absolute dominance. The life lesson here is deeply grim. When a predator effortlessly proves that your walls cannot protect you, the natural human instinct to fight back simply crumbles into ash. The camera lingers on her trembling hands as Dante continues the cold dissection of her life. He weaponizes her poverty, citing her unpaid rent. Panic crashes over her, turning her skin to ice. Terrified, she confesses her fear. Dante's reply is a masterclass in manufactured vulnerability. He claims he is simply not good at being human. By painting his predatory nature as a tragic flaw, he violently pulls the strings of her caretaker instincts. She romanticizes his absolute lack of empathy, viewing it as a bleeding wound rather than a lethal threat. Defying her instinct to survive, she replies that everyone is merely pretending. In that moment, she actively lays the final bricks of her own psychological prison. You and I must recognize this tragic truth. Empathy is a beautiful gift, but handing it to a starving wolf will only guarantee your destruction. Their exchange mirrors a cold, clinical interrogation. He asks for a meeting, and her internal alarms flare. She knows exactly who Dante is, a ruthless architect of violence who destroys his enemies without remorse. Yet, her emotions are already compromised. She fixates on a tiny crack in his armor, projecting her own deep fear of invisibility onto his psychopathic emptiness. This is the tragic crux of the human heart. We so often believe our love alone can cure the monster. She agrees to meet at Millennium Park at 2 in the afternoon, setting a fragile boundary about her shift. He promises she will not be late, an assertion of control beautifully disguised as care. She has the power to walk away forever, yet she willingly steps onto the path of her own destruction. She abandons her final chance at self-preservation, sending a single word that seals her fate. She suffers through an agonizing night of insomnia, her nervous system burning too hot for sleep. Stick with me here, because this is where the tragic patterns become undeniable. By 2 o'clock, the park is a dizzying overload of restless crowds and noise. Arya stands before the polished steel monument, observing her distorted reflection, a cinematic mirror for her fracturing identity. We often try to mask our deepest wounds with superficial choices. Before leaving, she changes clothes 5 times to manage her crushing anxiety. She settles on worn denim and a thick jacket, desperately crafting a subconscious layer of armor against the manipulation she is about to face. She feels a dizzying cognitive dissonance the moment he appears. When Dante speaks, her body betrays her with a sharp startle. He maintains a calculated distance, wearing dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. These are dominance displays, perfectly crafted to hide his eyes and project absolute superiority. Their tense dialogue circles the unreliability of human promises. Then, he deploys his most devastating weapon. He removes the glasses, revealing a flawless, manufactured facade of nervousness. It reminds us that true predators always know exactly what their target desperately needs to see. By feigning genuine anxiety, he seamlessly convinces his willing victim to walk right beside him, guiding her steadily into the isolating, shadowy labyrinth of the public gardens. You and I are watching a tragic masterclass in psychological manipulation. Dante maintains a calculated distance, a deliberate display of restraint designed to make his prey feel safe. When he asks about her art, he is actively hunting for her emotional baseline. Arya considers deception our natural human defense, but a megalomaniac exerts a terrifying gravity that demands compliance. Her voice trembles as she confesses that she paints to survive the overload of her reality, throwing chaotic color onto canvas when the world becomes intolerable. By extracting this personal admission, Dante bypasses her outer defenses. The life lesson here is chillingly simple. The very moment we confess our survival mechanisms to a predator, we hand them the blueprint to our own cage. Arya quietly admits her art erases her feelings of invisibility. Notice how ruthlessly Dante seizes upon this vulnerability. He anchors them in an isolated area of the park, far from the safety of the crowd. Then he convinces her to take him to her apartment. Her initial reaction is rational. She correctly identifies the danger of inviting a syndicate boss into her sanctuary. Yet he steps closer, invading her space to establish physical dominance. He whispers that he has not felt alive in 12 long years, using manufactured vulnerability as a jagged hook. She sees the threat, even telling him out loud that he is dangerous and she should run. This reveals a deeply tragic human flaw, hearing the warning bells ringing clearly, yet choosing to stay inside the burning house anyway. The predator silently tests the limits of his control. He reaches out with agonizing slowness, offering a false window to escape before his fingers graze her cheek. His touch is deliberately gentle, engineered to create cognitive dissonance. He whispers she will not run, verbally stripping away her autonomy. Cornered, Arya demands one true confession. Dante deploys the devastating weapon of the megalomaniac, the illusion of a tortured soul. He claims he is tired of being a monster, saying her gaze makes him feel normal again. This calculated confession hangs heavy in the fading light. He frames himself as a wounded beast begging for redemption. Empathy is a beautiful trait, but we must remember a hard truth. When empathy is offered to someone entirely devoid of a conscience, it becomes our fatal weakness. The camera pushes in slowly as she whispers her surrender. The spatial dynamics violently shift the second the apartment door clicks shut. Dante does not just step into the dimly lit room. His sheer presence consumes the oxygen. He stands dead center, his dark eyes absorbing the chaotic explosions of crimson, gold, and violent purples bleeding across her canvases. He reads her pain in the angry black strokes, validating her trauma by calling the brutal work honest. By praising her broken pieces, he becomes her sole savior. You and I must remember a simple, painful truth about human nature. Dangerous people do not look for the bright light in us. They carefully study the shadows where we hide, just waiting for an open door. We watch the psychological dismantling unfold frame by frame. Dante steps closer, praising her raw honesty, swearing she is the only one who refuses to wear a mask. He elevates her above the rest of the cold world, a classic trigger for Stockholm Syndrome. He crosses the peeling floorboards in 3 quick strides. His radiating body heat and the scent of expensive cologne overwhelm her rational thoughts. He whispers she is the first real thing he has touched in 10 years. In that breath, Arya feels every internal wall shatter. She tries to name the terrifying danger he brings, but the words die in her throat. The hardest life lesson to swallow is this: when a lonely person is finally made to feel truly seen, all basic self-preservation simply melts away. Harsh shadows fall across his jawline as he speaks her deepest fears aloud, validating her instinct to run while demanding she stay. His rough thumb gently brushes her trembling cheekbone. He begs for one quiet night away from his own monstrous nature. A healthy mind would flee, but the mix of pure terror and blinding empathy floods her nervous system. She pushes up on her toes and presses her lips to his. The fragile kiss turns into a hungry confirmation of her own capture. He crushes her against his chest, physically securing his prize. They break apart, and he whispers that this changes everything. We can learn a tragic lesson here. True control happens not when a cage is locked from the outside, but when the prisoner willingly swallows the only key. You and I are watching the exact moment a trauma bond turns to stone. Dante makes no empty promises. He refuses to guarantee her safety, painting his world in shades of unforgiving violence. Instead of running, Arya demands to see his bare soul, fatally confusing shared darkness with true intimacy. For hours, they sit on the cold floor trading ghosts. He speaks of his bloody rise through the Chicago syndicate. She hands over her deepest shame, weeping over her failing career and dying mother. He strips away all the romance of his criminal life. He understands a terrifying truth, offering a life lesson we must never forget. When you carefully mix absolute, paralyzing fear with a sudden flash of emotional vulnerability, you forge the heaviest chains imaginable. He details the brutal mechanics of his everyday existence, speaking of unmarked graves and silenced enemies. He frames his cold detachment as a tragic necessity, whispering that he became so untouchable he simply forgot how to be touched. Arya listens with wide eyes, offering him the pure validation that a hungry ego demands. She feels as though she is bleeding out and healing at the exact same time. Suddenly, a ringing phone shatters the quiet room. As Dante answers, the wounded boy instantly vanishes. The calculating crime boss snaps right back into his rigid spine. It brings us to a harsh but meaningful life lesson. A dangerous person's soft side is never the start of a beautiful redemption story. It is merely a psychological weapon. Packed away the second reality resumes. Dante hangs up, manufacturing a pained expression to show a bitter war between his desire to stay and his violent obligations. He murmurs he has a situation to handle. Desperate to keep her place in his dark world, she offers total understanding. He kisses her deep, planting a deliberate physical anchor to keep her addicted. The second the door closes, her apartment feels as empty as a cathedral. She touches her swollen lips, her mind drowning in a lethal flood of dopamine. She invited a monster and she is already starving for his return. Suddenly, her phone buzzes with an urgent text from her manager, Robert. Here is our final life lesson. No matter how safe an isolated bubble feels, it will always shatter against the cold, hard concrete of reality. The camera pans across the glittering, unforgiving Chicago skyline. Down below, Aria felt that heavy dread settling into her stomach about the meeting to come. Yet, instead of running, she retreated deep into the quiet safety of her own delusions. She pictured the way Dante looked at her paintings, handling her with a terrifyingly manufactured fragility. She took the dark history he had fed her and spun it into a tragic romance. She knew her soul could never survive his brutal world, but she stepped toward the danger anyway. She equated the treacherous beauty of the city with the man who had just dismantled her mind, convinced he had simply stolen her heart. You and I have probably both made this mistake, tragically confusing the systematic destruction of our boundaries for an epic romance. Cut to the back office, a room vibrating with panic that offered a brutal contrast to her romanticized daydream. Her manager, Robert, paced the floor, sweating. It was the exact reaction a normal person has when crossing paths with an apex predator. Aria just sat there, completely detached, her vision blurred by the heavy fog of a trauma bond. She calmly asked if she was being fired, brushing off the tension as if it were just about a shattered wine glass. Robert let out a sharp, breathless laugh, desperate to crack through her massive cognitive dissonance. He told her 3 different board members had already called, begging to know how he lured Dante into the dining room. Aria just blinked. She was trapped so deeply in her own mind that she could not even see the terrifying grip he held on the city. The predator was closing the net with a flawless strategy. Robert wiped his face, explaining that Dante had reserved the private dining room and specifically demanded Aria to serve him. Notice her reaction in this frame. Instead of recognizing a terrifying Delay's display of territorial control, she softened, interpreting the trap as sweet, romantic flattery. Robert looked sick to his stomach, realizing she had just been hooked by the most lethal man in Chicago. Aria simply shrugged, claiming she never meant for this to happen. Robert was trapped. Deny the request and face absolute ruin, or allow it and watch the fallout. Aria quietly agreed to take the table. It is deeply heartbreaking to watch someone stop fighting the dark water, simply letting the violent undertow drag them quietly down to the bottom. Robert leaned in and trying to shatter the glass walls of her delusion. He bluntly reminded her that Dante was a lethal predator who extinguished lives with his bare hands, carrying a grotesque reputation. Deep inside, Aria instantly raised her emotional shields to protect her captor. She felt a burning need to defend the man who had looked at her paintings like they were sacred texts, the man who kissed her with a beautifully manufactured desperation. This fierce urge to shield the monster is the true hallmark of a trauma bond. Yet, somewhere in the darkest corner of her mind, a tiny voice heard Robert. She had only seen the mask. Here is a hard truth we must carry. Predators never show their sharpest teeth while they are still trying to coax you into their cage. Arya promised to be careful, but it was a hollow lie. The dark compulsion to pull closer to her captor overpowered her logic. Her fingers trembled as she texted him about the reservation. His reply came instantly, a deeply calculated strike to reinforce her special status. He claimed the distance was agonizing, begging her to arrive early because he missed her. Let us be clear about what we are watching here. This is the final, fatal turn of the psychological screw. By making Arya believe she was the sole key to unlocking his buried heart, he cemented her blind devotion. She smiled at the glowing screen, ignoring her own chains. Always remember, when a known monster swears, you are the rare exception to their cruelty. You are never the exception. You are just the newest victim. We can trace the exact onset of the syndrome right here. Her reality was fracturing. Earlier, she agreed to a 4 p.m. meeting while insisting she had to work, masking her panic with a sharp laugh that ignored the judgment of a passing executive. Back in her dim apartment, she stood under a scalding shower, trying to shock her nervous system into resetting. Staring into the fogged mirror, she experienced true dissociation. Just 2 days ago, she was a ghost in this city. Now, a megalomaniac was bending his empire to maintain absolute dominance over her mind. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. An untraceable caller, she answered, and a cold, highly professional female voice echoed through the quiet room, asking for her. Her name was Victoria Cross. Stick with me. Today we are going to look closely at how trauma bonding actually takes root. The catalyst dropped when a Chicago Tribune reporter called her, probing about her connection to Dante Varelli. In a purely clinical sense, you can see her nervous system shut down, her blood running cold. She immediately entered the denial phase, aggressively claiming she did not know him. But the journalist pressed harder, referencing his highly public and unusual visit to her building. When the reporter explicitly warned her about the blood on Dante's hands, Arya slammed the phone down. A crushing wave of acute paranoia flooded her chest as unknown numbers began lighting up her screen. Finally, a text cut through the chaos. It was the predator himself. The invisible web was pulling tighter. Let us look closely at the text Dante sent her. He instructed her to ignore the outside world, swearing he would handle the fallout. This is the absolute textbook maneuver of a narcissist. By setting himself up as her only shield, he forcefully built a cage of predatory isolation around her. Arya desperately reached out for a shred of psychological comfort, but instead, she was violently shoved into his reality, a dark, paranoid existence where privacy does not exist. Her nerves were utterly frayed. It is exactly in this hypervigilant, exhausted state that a familiar ringtone shattered the silence. She picked up, and her mother's voice poured through the speaker. It was a jagged, volatile mix of raw maternal fury and sheer, unadulterated panic, striking her right in the chest. The mother's frantic intervention is an agonizing scene to witness. She caught the media whispers and demanded to know why her daughter was entangled with a crime boss. Cornered, Arya fell back on minimization. She swore it was merely a transaction, just a waitress and a wealthy patron. But her mother saw straight through the fog, diagnosing the sick pathology at play. With a trembling voice, she begged her daughter to listen, warning her that men with this dark profile do not feel love the way we do. They consume. They drain a person's soul until nothing is left but an empty shell. It is a harsh, universal truth we desperately try to ignore when we are lonely. Predators do not nurture the things they claim to care about. They merely feed on them. Watch how the camera focuses on Arya's face, capturing the painful weight of her cognitive dissonance. She promised her mother she understood the danger, but the tremor in her voice exposed a profound self-deception. After hanging up, she sat in the dark, surrounded by her canvases. Through her warped psychological state, those paintings morphed from expressions of lonely beauty into glaring, subconscious warning signs. As she made her way across the city to the restaurant, a sickening hyper-vigilance gripped her. Her eyes darted everywhere. The man reading a paper, the woman on her phone, they all looked like spies in Dante's network. The bitter, metallic taste of paranoia coated her mouth. By the time she pushed through the heavy doors, her anxiety was a raging fire. Now, let us examine the moment they finally collide. Arya climbed the stairs to the private dining room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dante was waiting by the window, executing a masterclass in physical disarmament. His heavy suit jacket was discarded, sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of a Latin tattoo on his forearm. This deliberate shedding of his intimidating armor was designed purely to manufacture intimacy. He smirked at her early arrival, wearing the smug triumph of a hunter. When she breathlessly demanded how the media found them out, his answer was chillingly calm. A random photographer in the park, he claimed. Notice how smoothly he shifts the blame to the universe, reminding her that he controls almost everything, trapping her deeper in his web. Come with me. We are about to see exactly how the trap snaps shut. When Arya fully grasped that she could not control the narrative, her survival instincts flared. She backed away, stammering that this entire association was a mistake. In 3 swift, silent strides, Dante closed the distance, his hands gripping her arms to physically ground her panic. Then, he dropped his ultimate weapon, manufactured vulnerability. His voice dropped to a rough whisper as he claimed he had spent 12 untouchable years rotting in isolation, slowly dying inside until she dropped that wine glass and brought his soul back to life. It is terrifyingly brilliant. By painting her as his lone savior, he violently anchored her budding Stockholm syndrome into a sweeping, intoxicating, romantic fantasy. The psychological warfare here is masterful. Dante did not deny the danger. Instead, he twisted it. He reframed the terrifying media leaks and her mother's panic as a necessary toll they had to pay for his emotional salvation. He pulled her close, begging for one chance to prove the chaos was worth the pain. And what was the prize? The illusion of being truly understood. He weaponized her deepest insecurities, taking her lifelong fear of being invisible and turning it into unbreakable chains. She actually whispered that they were both insane, her logical mind screaming at her to run. But the snare was already locked. He pulled her into a desperate, heavy kiss, using the sheer force of physical intimacy to completely shatter her logic and guarantee her total surrender. The camera focuses on Arya, standing in the chaotic restaurant, trying desperately to carve out a sliver of control in a game she has already lost. Dante simply commanded her to join him upstairs, effortlessly erasing her job by whispering a few calculated words to her boss. He is a man who engineers every detail, leaving her as his only chaotic variable. Against every human instinct screaming for self-preservation, she agreed, demanding only his absolute truth in return. She foolishly believed this gave her power. Instead, watch how her body betrays her. Her hands tremble as she drops glasses, her mind entirely severed from the room, dragged upward toward the dark confrontation waiting for her. Stick with me. We are about to watch her step over the edge. Her manager essentially banishes her from the floor, easily reading the undeniable fracture in her composure. Upstairs, Dante has staged the room like a dark Renaissance painting. Low firelight, heavy crystal, breathing wine. When Arya finally demands his truth, she strikes at the absolute darkest nerve, asking for his body count. A normal man would hesitate. Dante simply calculates. He remains perfectly still, a cold statue, admitting to 4 personal executions and dozens more orchestrated from the shadows. He frames the slaughter with chilling, Darwinian precision. The lesson is simple. Never mistake a monster's cold logic for sanity. Observe the terrifying emptiness in his posture. He offers exactly 0 apologies for the lives he has erased, holding the mirror up and daring her to speak the word monster. Here, under the velvet shadows of the room, her defenses completely collapse. Instead of sprinting away from a confessed butcher, Arya wades deeper into the moral grey. She anchors herself to the phantom memory of his gentle hands, the way he admired her paintings, the ruinous softness of his kiss. She desperately argues that humanity is just a pendulum swinging between saint and savage. By begging to see his deepest wounds, she willingly locks her own cage. Understanding a demon never guarantees it won't ultimately devour you. Desperation makes us reach for impossible bridges. To span the terrifying moral chasm between them, Arya offers up her own fragile sin. Her voice shakes as she admits to stealing cheap paints while her mother lay dying, driven by a blinding, suffocating need to create anything while her world burned down. She offers this to prove she is also broken. Dante, playing the tragic mirror flawlessly, seizes the offering. He nods, validating this absurd comparison with the solemn gravity of a priest. He whispers that murder and petty theft are born from the exact same frantic pulse of survival. With just a few calculated words, he completely dissolves the boundary between a mourning girl and a ruthless killer. Let's pause here and look at the wreckage of his past together. Arya pushes him to describe the very first time he took a breath away. The lighting shifts, bruising his face in shadow as Dante recalls being 19. It was a trauma ordered by his own father, a brutal initiation to silence a traitor. He describes the man begging with a voice completely devoid of an echo. He admits to the violent physical aftermath, the agonizing sickness, the days completely stripped of sleep. But then comes the chilling pivot. He learned to sever the bleeding, human part of his soul, locking it away in a dark, violent vault in his mind. Evil is rarely born. It is usually beaten into existence by those supposed to protect us. Watch her eyes in this irreversible, tragic moment. She truly believes she sees the rusted hinges of that locked vault giving way just for her. Her compassion fatally mutates into a romanticized savior complex. Slowly, her trembling fingers cross the linen, weaving themselves into the heavy hands of a murderer. She whispers into the silence, questioning her own sanity for loving a man carved entirely from violence. Dante refuses to coat the truth in sugar. He looks at her with a devastating clarity, acknowledging that he will almost certainly drag her into the dirt. Yet, his grip on her hand tightens like an iron vice. He is utterly starved for the light she bleeds, anchoring them both in a fatal trauma bond. Notice the exact second the iron collar of their bond snaps definitively shut. A healthy mind would hear the warning, push the chair back, and sprint. Arya does the exact opposite. She rounds the table, drawn by a gravitational pull of pure, aching desperation, and kisses him. It is a bruised, frantic collision, fueled by the terrifying knowledge that their reality is destined to shatter. When they finally pull back for air, Dante presses his heavy forehead against hers. He asks her to stay the night, not at his lavish penthouse, but at his secret sanctuary. He offers a hidden kingdom meant only for two. Arya simply nods, desperate to wake up in his arms just once. Never let deep loneliness rewrite your survival instincts. Every alarm bell behind her eyes is ringing, begging her to run while she still can. The emotional current is moving far too fast, dragging her under. But we must weigh the crushing gravity of her isolation. The shivering part of her psyche, the part that simply begs to be truly seen, violently overrides her logic. They slip out a back exit into the freezing night air, stepping into a waiting, black sedan. Dante's hand rests heavy and possessive at the base of her spine. As the car glides into the quiet, old money streets, the imposing brownstone they enter feels jarringly peaceful. The interior completely betrays his brutal reputation. When we mute our inner warnings just to feel wanted, we turn the key to the cage. The camera sweeps through the space, revealing a meticulously arranged illusion of a normal life. Rich hard wood, exposed brick, a kitchen that has actually seen warm meals. When she questions the undeniable warmth of it, Dante's voice softens. He explains that the glass penthouse is nothing more than a theatrical stage. This is his actual sanctuary. Then, he slides the hook in deep, murmuring that no one has crossed this threshold in 5 long years. By placing her on a pedestal above the rest of the world, he expertly weaponizes her craving to be special. As she wanders the room, she freezes before a massive, bleeding painting on the wall. If there is a truth for you and I to remember, it is this. A dangerous man's vulnerability is very often just a more sophisticated mask. She recognizes the canvas instantly from her abandoned days as a student, a genuine Rothko. It is a violent collision of slashed reds and bruised blacks, worth millions. She feels a magnetic pull to the heavy strokes, whispering that the art is pure chaos and rage held together by an agonizingly rigid structure, control masking a massacre. It is a flawless mirror of the man breathing softly right behind her. He stands just close enough for his heat to wash over her, projecting sheer dominance. When she turns, his eyes demand she strip away all her polite fictions. He guides her into the bedroom, and the intimacy that follows is a shocking contrast to his violent world. It is agonizingly slow, reverent, and devastatingly tender. He touches her as if she might shatter into dust. In the quiet dimness, her trembling fingertips slowly map the brutal geography of his skin. She traces the jagged ridge of a knife wound across his ribs, the puckered hollow of a bullet graze biting his shoulder. Every scar is a loud, permanent record of his savage existence. When she softly asks if the ghosts still hurt him, he whispers that only her touch makes the agony stop. Their union becomes an act of desperate survival, a fragile shelter built in a war zone. Tangled in the heavy sheets, he pulls her against his chest. Into the silence, he confesses that he is falling deeply in love with her, and in the exact same breath swears he will absolutely destroy her. The lesson is etched in stone. When a demon warns you of his fire, you must believe him the very first time. A sharp physical ache explodes in her chest, violently stealing her breath. She grips his arm and begs him not to break her. Dante, playing the role of the cursed romantic tragedy, buries his face in her hair and whispers he doesn't know how to do anything else. This is the core of the captive's disease. The victim looks at the captor's bleeding dysfunction and decides it is a puzzle they must solve together. She vows to learn how to survive his shadows. It is a beautiful, catastrophic mistake. They sleep, two profoundly shattered pieces desperately trying to mimic a whole. But at 3 in the morning, primal instinct forces her eyes open. The bed is cold. Panic spikes her pulse until she sees him, standing by the window, staring out entirely alone in the freezing dark. He doesn't even turn to look at her as she sits up. Instead, his voice slices through the room, cold and entirely stripped of the tenderness from hours before. He lays bare the terrifying mechanics of his empire. His enemies will look at her and see a weapon. They will tear her apart just to watch the light die in his eyes. He speaks a name that chills the room. Victor Klov, a rival who has spent 2 brutal years trying to butcher his way to Dante's throne. If Klov finds her, he will take his time, and he will mail Dante the bloody pieces. Arya swallows her nausea, offering a pathetic promise to just be careful. But you and I both know the tragic truth of this life. Once you step out into the darkest waters, there is absolutely no shallow end left for you to hide in. You and I are watching a tragedy unfold, frame by inevitable frame. Dante shatters the last mirror of her romantic illusions. The room is steeped in suffocating shadows as he tells her the truth. There is no happy ending. There is only survival and the high probability of a violent death. But watch Arya. She steps forward, forcing him to meet her eyes. Her hands tremble from the weight of finally being seen. For years, she was a ghost, serving food to faceless strangers, starving for a single touch. She looks at this dangerous man and calls him her savior, choosing the fire of his world over the cold of her invisible one. The human heart is tragically adaptable. We will gladly drink poison if it is the only way to finally feel alive. She leans into the fatalism, her voice a fragile whisper. If she dies, she says, she will die having been truly perceived. Dante pulls her against his chest. His shoulders shake in a tragic collision of a laugh and an agonizing sob. He whispers that she is completely out of her mind, and she smiles against his collarbone. They fall into each other, racing against a violently shrinking clock. Then comes the morning, painting the skyline sign in lying pinks. The illusion shatters with a single phone call. Victor Klov knows everything. The leak is real. Klov has the photographs, her exact address. The wolves are at the door. It reminds us of a bitter truth. No matter how tightly we close our eyes, the morning always brings the consequences of the night. The cold panic sets in, chilling the room. Arya frantically searches for a tactical way out, but Dante has already moved the pieces on the board. He tells her that her mother is hidden away from the impending slaughter. He frames her face in his scarred hands. The lighting catches the sheer terror in his dark eyes, a man terrified not for his own life, but for hers. He demands absolute obedience, masking his desperate need to control as protective care. He swears an oath to keep her safe, promising to burn the city down if necessary. Yet, as the words leave his mouth, his voice breaks. The untouchable criminal empire he built is actively collapsing. We often learn too late that the walls we build to keep the world out will eventually become the very stones that crush us. Let us pause and look closely at her mind in this frame. She chose this nightmare, trading her quiet safety for a terrifying visibility. Now she must swallow the psychological ashes of that choice. The next 3 days blur into a sickening montage of waitressing and hyperventilation. She forces a bright plastic smile for the patrons, her internal clock ticking down to 0. The camera pans to the corner booths. She sees them now. Dante's men, suits cut perfectly over shoulder holsters, sipping cold coffee, their eyes tracking her every single step. Dante calls this an invisible shield of protection. To Arya, The air feels exactly like the crushing walls of a prison. It is a harsh truth of life. Freedom traded for security is often just a prettier cage with a different lock. Their routine decays into a haunting pantomime of normal life. After her shift, he drives her to the brownstone, where they play the roles of a couple in a movie doomed to end in tragedy. She cooks dinner. He sits in the shadows, his eyes tracking her every movement, fascinated by this strange illusion of peace. They watch television in silence, using physical intimacy as a barricade against the reality outside. Then, on the fourth day, the fragile glass breaks. Her phone begins to vibrate at the diner. Slipping into the cold tiles of the restroom, she stares at the screen. 7 missed calls from Dante, 3 frantic messages. It is a quiet reminder that pretending a storm does not exist will never actually stop the rain from breaking through your roof. The text on the screen is cold and absolute. Call me now. Her fingers tremble violently as she presses the glass. He answers before the first ring finishes. His voice is a rigid mask of authority, but beneath the syllables, she can hear the suffocating grip of panic. He asks where she is. The moment she says she is at work, the bomb drops. Victor Klov has struck a South Side warehouse. 3 of Dante's men are bleeding out on the concrete. The message left behind was meant only for him. A stolen photograph of Aria, with coordinates scrawled across her face. Midnight, Navy Pier. Come alone, or her body parts will be shipped to the morning news. The clinical lesson here is brutally simple. In the dark game of absolute power, romantic love is nothing but the perfect weapon. Through the tiny speaker of the phone, she hears the terrifying sound of a criminal empire loading its weapons. Dante barks a hard, unbreakable command. She has to run. Right now. Marco is idling in a car outside, waiting to bury her in a nameless safe house in Evanston. Her breathing turns ragged as she begs for a timeline, a promise of when she will see him again. He has no answer. The devastating truth crashes over her. He is locking her in a box so he can walk directly into his own execution. She begs him not to go to the pier. But the tragic king is chained by his own twisted code of honor. If he refuses, the streets will run red. It teaches us a painful reality. The darkest prisons we will ever find ourselves trapped inside are always built by our own pride. Stick with me, because this is where the mind of a killer gets fascinating. Men like Dante operate entirely on controlled isolation and lethal contingency. He knows that drawing an apex predator out requires a very public, neutral battlefield. Navy Pier is perfect on paper, but the moment his compulsion to protect the woman collides with his cold logic, the perfect machine breaks down. The camera holds on his face as he desperately tries to soothe her weeping, reminding her that he has survived this underworld for 15 brutal years. It is a deeply flawed defense mechanism. That the ultimate lie we tell ourselves is that cheating death in the past somehow gives us armor for the future. Against a monster like Klov, past luck means absolutely nothing. Now, let the lens shift back to Aria. What we are witnessing is the darkest mutation of the human heart. Her pulse is now entirely synchronized with the survival of her captor. She knows he is walking into a graveyard, but Dante, blinded by arrogant pride, refuses to accept his own mortality. He offers her the ultimate escape hatch. Marco, stacks of cash, a clean slate. He begs her to keep painting, desperate to find his own soul's absolution through her art. But it is far too late. She looks at the open door of freedom and slams it shut. She no longer wants to be safe. She only wants the man who built her labyrinth. The tragedy of love is that we will happily throw away our salvation if it means we get to burn in the fire with the one we choose. Whispered words of love become the only anchor keeping a soul tethered to the earth. Hot tears carve lines down her face as she speaks the words back to him. Dante confesses his ultimate sin. She has completely shattered his sociopathic armor. She made a monster feel human. They refuse to say goodbye, clinging fiercely to the fragile lie of a temporary farewell. She hangs up and stares at her reflection in the dirty restroom mirror. The terror in her eyes is absolute, yet it sets her blood on fire. We often forget this hard truth. It is only when we are seconds away from losing absolutely everything that we realize what it actually means to be alive. Fueled by this beautiful madness, she slips out the back door, leaves Marco behind, and steps onto a train rushing toward the dark water. The camera follows her into the train car, her face a mask of terrifying resolve. Her mind has collapsed into a single burning directive: get to the fire. If Dante actually believed she would sit quietly in a safe house, he severely underestimated the depth of their twisted bond. The train rattles forward, carrying her past oblivious civilians living their safe lives, completely blind to the war about to erupt on the shoreline. Her phone lights up in the dark. Marco, then Dante. Without a flicker of emotion, she powers the device down. By 11 p.m., Navy Pier is a ghost town. The cold wind bites at her skin as she slips past the guards. It is a sobering lesson about human nature. Logic and self-preservation will always lose the battle against a truly obsessive heart. Let us look at the framing of this final shot together. Moving on pure adrenaline, she finds a rusted maintenance door from an old memory. The camera tracks her boots, echoing up the oxidized metal staircases, climbing higher until she reaches a suspended catwalk overlooking the main plaza. From here, she plays the role of a silent god. She sees everything: the dead silhouette of the Ferris wheel, the deep shadows where the killers will enter. As midnight creeps closer, a freezing fog rolls off the dark lake, swallowing the pier whole. Her muscles scream in agony, but she does not move. And then, the dark coat of the man she loves bleeds out of the mist. We learn here that true devotion is not found in safety, but in standing willingly at the edge of the abyss. The camera pans across the thoroughfare as Dante steps into frame. His gait is the relaxed movement of a predator walking willingly into a snare. He carries no weapons, a calculated display of sheer invulnerability. Instantly, the trap snaps shut. 6 armed operatives materialize from the shadows, severing every route of egress. At the dead center stands Victor Klov, a man in his mid-50s, possessing the rigid demeanor of a seasoned sociopath. The damp fog swallows the ambient noise, creating a claustrophobic acoustic suppression. Through that mist, Victor's voice cuts like dull glass, mockingly labeling Dante as entirely predictable. It is a harsh truth of human nature. Sometimes, the boldest display of courage is simply a mask for a deep underlying wish to finally be destroyed. Victor speaks with heavy, deliberate enunciation, weaponizing his cadence to assert absolute dominance. When he asks about the girl, Dante maintains his deception of security, but a narcissist derives ultimate gratification from tearing down a rival's reality. Slowly, Victor produces a physical artifact. It is a small canvas, Aria's artwork, extracted directly from her private sanctuary. The camera lingers on Dante's eyes. This is a profound psychological strike. By casually displaying this stolen piece, Victor proves the perimeter is breached. It forces us to confront a heartbreaking reality. No matter how high we build our walls to protect the people we cherish, the darkest and most destructive threats will always find a way to slip right through the cracks. You and I are going to unpack this moment together. This is the exact second a psychopath isolates a fatal flaw. Victor knows physical territories mean nothing. True destruction requires the annihilation of emotional anchors. He openly mocks Dante's newfound attachment, labeling the innocent waitress as a critical liability. Notice the physiological response. A microscopic shift in Dante's posture signals terminal intent. The operatives elevate their weapons, yet Dante exhibits zero defensive posturing. Up above, the chilling realization materializes in Aria's tear-filled eyes. Her protector had not arrived to fight. He consciously selected this fog-choked location for his own execution. The tragedy of love is that it often turns us into willing martyrs for those who never asked for our sacrifice. Disrupting a planned execution requires chaotic intervention. Bypassing all logic, Aria seizes a heavy metallic fragment, her hands trembling as she propels it toward the electrical terminal 20 feet away. The impact triggers a massive cascade of systemic failures. Piercing sirens activate. High-intensity floodlights violently illuminate the dark sector. This sensory overload fractures the syndicate's formation, scattering the operatives. Victor retreats into the vapor, his voice echoing with blind rage. Below, Dante's eyes snap upward, locking onto her silhouette. His expression cycles from profound shock to aggressive hostility before initiating a frantic withdrawal. It teaches us a vital lesson. Sometimes, the only way to save a doomed life is to completely shatter the rules of the game. The camera follows her frantic descent down the rusted framework. She is breathless, her palms abraded by jagged metal. Bursting through the egress point, she collides with Dante's rigid chest. He subjects her to a violent verbal interrogation, completely destabilized by her presence. Her desperate justification of preserving his life is met with extreme resistance. All around them, the environment deteriorates into chaos as security mobilizes. Recognizing the narrowing window of escape, Dante secures her arm, forcing their extraction through a dark service corridor. They breach the perimeter just as Marco arrives in a black transport vehicle. True survival often demands a heavy price. We must learn to abandon our rigid pride and allow ourselves to be rescued by the people we swore to protect. Suffocating silence dominates the vehicle for 60 agonizing seconds. The streetlights bleed through the tinted glass, illuminating their tragic dynamic. Dante initiates a raw psychological confrontation, articulating the bleak reality of his strategy. It was a premeditated, suicidal act to achieve proximity to Victor, sacrificing his own existence to keep her safe. His state is violently agitated. In response, Aria demonstrates a fierce resistance to traditional victimhood. She categorically refuses to accept a passive role while he absorbs fatal damage on her behalf. Dante rigidly reiterates his function as her absolute protector, entirely unable to process her demand for agency. It is a painful reminder. When we love someone deeply, denying them the right to fight beside us is just another subtle form of emotional imprisonment. The fragile illusion of safety shatters when Marco delivers a catastrophic update. Let us look closely at the turning point of this tragedy. During the peer confrontation, Victor's faction executed a devastating strike on Dante's logistics facility, but the lost capital means nothing. Marco hands over a device displaying the forensic aftermath of Aria's shattered residence. Her beautiful artifacts are mutilated, and a chilling threat is painted in red pigment on the walls. Tick-tock. The camera focuses on Dante's cold expression. He dismisses the destruction of her artwork entirely, reducing the entire equation to her basic biological survival. Victor has formally initiated total warfare. We learn a bitter lesson here. In the face of absolute annihilation, all of our precious material attachments fade into meaningless ash, leaving only the raw, primitive desperation to keep breathing. The psychological regression we witness here is both terrifying and entirely predictable. Dante immediately initiates full mobilization protocols. His voice is a flat, dead monolith as he instructs Marco to activate every available lethal asset, demanding the total incineration of Victor's infrastructure. When Arya tearfully attempts to appeal to the gentle human empathy he had previously displayed, he explicitly admits to deceiving her. The warm indicators of emotional availability completely vanish, replaced by the profound predatory void she had observed during their first encounter. The protective entity is completely submerged, and the sociopathic enforcer has resumed total cognitive control. It is a haunting reflection of human trauma. The monsters we bury never truly die. They merely sleep, waiting for the perfect moment of devastating pain to break their chains and return to the surface. Dante establishes absolute frigid boundaries, explicitly denying her the privilege of requesting mercy. Victor's intrusion has triggered an irrevocable behavioral shift. The camera captures Dante's sorrow as he articulates his intention to fully embody his monstrous persona. Yet, he offers one heartbreaking promise. If she remains waiting after the slaughter, he will attempt to simulate humanity for her once more. Upon arriving at the fortified residence, he institutes severe lockdown parameters, stripping her of physical autonomy. He categorizes his departure simply as a dark hunt with no defined duration. In a final, desperate act of emotional grounding, her trembling hands secure his face, forcing an intense ocular connection. We must understand this truth. In moments of sheer darkness, a single loving touch is often the only tether keeping a fractured soul from drifting entirely into the abyss. We begin our observation at the agonizing point of traumatic separation. Notice Arya desperately begging Dante not to lose his humanity. It is a tragic projection of her own psychological deterioration. That tear-stained kiss is not romance. It is a vital behavioral anchor. You and I are going to unpack this moment together, examining how extreme isolation triggers acute panic. Guarded by armed men while a war ignites, she spends the first hour pacing and the second staring at a silent device. By the third hour, her fractured mind seeks a coping mechanism. She discovers art supplies and begins painting. The violent slashes of red are a textbook manifestation of internalized terror, purging her psychological scream until the phone finally rings at 4 a.m. Isolation teaches us a brutal truth. Sometimes, the suffocating silence is much louder than the violence it hides. Observe the subtle auditory cues when she answers the phone. Dante's voice exhibits the hollow fatigue of prolonged hypervigilance. He coldly reports the destruction of 2 warehouses and the brutal neutralization of 3 lieutenants. When Arya asks if he is injured, his casual dismissal of trauma highlights a dangerous psychological dissociation. He estimates a week to extract Victor, a timeline triggering claustrophobic panic in Arya. She protests the loss of her autonomy, demanding her normal life back. This is a heartbreaking display of cognitive dissonance. She clings to the fragile illusion of the civilian world, while Dante has reduced her existence to a single variable, her physical preservation. She has functionally become a guarded possession. Our lesson here is sobering. When love transforms into absolute obsession, safety simply becomes another beautiful word for a permanent prison. Listen closely to the subtle crack in Dante's voice. It serves as a vital diagnostic marker, indicating severe emotional vulnerability in a man accustomed to absolute control. He frames her survival as a personal favor, shifting the heavy psychological burden onto her shoulders. Arya's tearful compliance clearly indicates the dark roots of Stockholm Syndrome taking hold. She overrides her own need for autonomy to soothe her protector. She demands he return, forbidding him from playing the tragic martyr. Quietly admitting he is no hero, he shows a rare moment of clinical self-awareness. When the connection terminates, she stares at her canvas. The frantic red strokes vividly symbolize her complete internal fragmentation. The ensuing 5 days of isolated confinement will only aggressively accelerate her dangerous emotional dependency. It is a tragic truth. We often willingly forge our own chains when the outside world becomes too terrifying to face alone. Let's step back and consider the devastating effects of sensory deprivation. Arya is suspended in psychological limbo, experiencing the world strictly through the reinforced glass of a gilded cage. Marco acts as her silent warden, delivering rations and sanitized updates. The civilian media incorrectly diagnoses the violence as a simple gang war, citing bodies in the river and burning buildings. Law enforcement offers empty rhetoric while the true power struggle rages unchecked. Dante's nightly phone calls become her only tether to reality, though they are steadily deteriorating. His auditory cues reveal a rapid descent into predatory behavior. Arya recognizes this tragic regression. The man she initially bonded with is actively mutating back into a sociopathic entity, consumed entirely by the brutal mechanics of fear and dominance. If we take away one profound lesson from this tragedy, it is this: the deepest scars are never left by the battles we fight, but by the quiet wars we lose inside our own minds. The morning of the 6th day bleeds into the room, casting long, bruised shadows across Marco's exhausted face. The camera of our mind focuses on his rigid posture, signaling a devastating shift. Vittorio is entrenched in a fortified Indiana warehouse, ringed by 20 heavily armed operatives and sniper overwatch. A direct assault is a guaranteed death sentence. So, Marco delivers the crushing blow. Dante is actually considering trading Arya to stop the slaughter. If Vittorio gets her, the war ends. Watch the micro-expressions on her face as her entire universe shatters. Sometimes, the hardest lesson we learn is that the people who promise to protect us are the very ones forced to hand us to the wolves. You and I have to look closely at the sheer cruelty of this ultimatum. Vittorio is demanding total systemic annihilation, promising to turn Dante's entire empire into ash and bone. When the weight of this betrayal hits Arya, her knees simply give out. She collapses into a chair, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet room. She tries to breathe, desperately whispering that Dante would never sell her. But Marco remains carved from stone. He forces her to look at the bleeding ledgers and the bodies piling up. Her mind twists the knife, believing she is just a cheap transaction for his empire. But Marco reveals a darker, more tragic truth. Dante would surrender her not for power, but to ensure she simply stays breathing. The camera pushes in on Marco as he lays out the grim mechanics of the trap. Vittorio has found the single chink in Dante's impenetrable armor. The narcissist knows exactly where to apply pressure, and he will press until the bone snaps. Arya drifts toward the cold glass of the window, pressing her forehead against it. Down below, everyday people walk with their coffees, completely unaware of the monsters moving among them. It is a harsh reminder that our deepest tragedies are entirely invisible to the passing world. She asks, voice barely more than a hollow rasp, what her life in a cage would look like. Marco does not spare her. Vittorio will keep her breathing, using her heartbeat as a perpetual leash around Dante's neck. The suffocating reality of this binary choice hangs thick in the stale air. If she stays, the blood will keep flowing until both empires burn to the ground. In the quiet dark, her mind desperately clings to the memory of Dante's confession, his 12 years of emotional numbness melting away just for her. It is a tragic textbook response, weaponizing her own trauma into a twisted form of heroism. She tells herself that Dante will find another way because losing her would shatter his pride. But the second she is left alone, the trembling panic takes the wheel. With shaking, bloodless fingers, she finds Vittorio's encrypted number. A profound lesson sits right here. Our desperate need to save the ones we love often drives us to our own execution. The line rings 3 times. Each tone feels like a heavy tolling bell. When the connection clicks, Vittorio speaks with the chilling, dead calm of a high-functioning sociopath. He does not yell. He softly, mockingly calls her the waitress, a cruel reminder of her fragile place in his brutal world. Aria grips the phone, her knuckles turning bone white, and demands a meeting. She insists that she will not be a helpless pawn in their war. She offers herself up, demanding total autonomy over her own destruction. Vittorio chuckles, a dry sound like crumbling leaves. He cannot resist the temptation. He simply must lay his eyes on the tiny, insignificant anomaly that managed to crack Dante's legendary iron heart. In this fractured moment, the power dynamic subtly shifts. Vittorio agrees to her desperate terms. She chooses the Art Institute, right at 12 noon. Knowing the heavy civilian foot traffic offers a fragile illusion of safety, you can almost hear the predatory amusement in his voice as he dismisses her amateur tactics. He sets one absolute rule. If he sees even a shadow of Dante's men, the world will burn. The moment the line goes dead, Aria drops the phone, her entire body seized by violent, uncontrollable tremors. The adrenaline leaves her system like rushing water. Her sacrifice is sealed. But before the silence can settle, her screen illuminates. It is Dante, and his raw, untethered fury vibrates through the glass. The digital interception is terrifyingly swift. Vittorio had already dangled her betrayal in front of Dante like a bleeding trophy. Through the speaker, Dante's voice is a dark, commanding thunder, outright forbidding her to step outside. His obsession has spiraled into absolute madness, a behavioral loop where he would gladly watch the whole city burn to ash just to keep her locked away. But Aria leans into the microphone, tears finally spilling hot down her cheeks. She turns his own fragile humanity against him. She tells him that being a real human being means making the agonizing choice to sacrifice yourself for the greater good. It is a beautiful, agonizing lesson. True love is never about possession. It is about having the strength to let go. Stick with me, because the final hours of her confinement are a masterclass in psychological agony. Aria ends the call and powers down the device entirely. The silence that follows is suffocating. Time itself seems to warp and stretch, every single minute dragging like a rusted anchor across the floorboards. Out in the hall, Marco pounds on the heavy oak door, his voice escalating from calm negotiation to desperate, furious commands. But she remains completely unresponsive, curled up in the darkness, detaching from her reality. By 10 in the morning, she begins a haunting, ritualistic preparation. She puts on the exact same clothes she wore the first night she met Dante. It is her armor, a desperate attempt to remember who she was before the monsters arrived. Looking in the mirror, she sees nothing but a terrified girl pretending to be brave. At 10:30 precisely, she moves to the heavy window lock. With steady, practiced hands, she uses techniques learned from a toxic ghost of her past, snapping the mechanism. She slides out onto the rusted fire escape, the cold wind whipping her hair as she bypasses Marco's heavy security perimeter. By the time she slips onto the crowded subway car, the contrast is deeply unsettling. She sits shoulder to shoulder with ordinary people reading newspapers and checking their watches. They are completely oblivious to the lethal, catastrophic weight she carries. It teaches us how easily we sit beside silent tragedies every single day on our morning commute. The rhythmic, metallic screech of the train mirrors the terrifying speed at which she is leaving her old life behind. She steps out into the grand, echoing halls of the cultural institution. This place holds the ghosts of her failed art school days, back when she mistakenly believed that painting loneliness could somehow cure it. But if there is one profound truth you and I can take from her solitary walk, it is this: nobody is coming to save you. Your rescue has to start entirely from within yourself. She positions herself in the main gallery right at 11:45, letting the thick crowd of tourists act as her fragile human shield. Her eyes scan the heavy doors. And then, precisely as the clock strikes 12, the devil himself walks in. Let us take a closer look at the terrifying body language of this encounter. Victor arrives completely alone, draped in a bespoke charcoal suit that hangs like financial armor, a stark contrast to Aria's worn-out jacket. As he takes the seat beside her, the cruel lighting highlights the jagged scar along his jaw, a biological receipt of a highly violent life. His pale eyes flick across the room with a cold, predatory intelligence. He refuses to offer her the dignity of direct eye contact, leaning heavily into his dominant position. He knows Dante's men are hiding in the wings, poorly disguised as eager tourists, and yet a chilling smirk pulls at the corner of his mouth. Aria breathes out her desperate lie. The trap has been sprung. Victor finally turns his head, and his gaze is less of a look and more of a surgical dissection. He catalogues the subtle tremble in her lip and the rapid pulse hammering in her throat. To a man like him, human beings are nothing more than loose gears in a machine. He leans back, crossing his long legs, radiating an absolute, terrifying relaxation. He softly mocks her bravery, calling her a little mouse who climbed out of a locked tower just to feed herself to a snake. He leans in close, the scent of expensive cologne and cold winter air settling over her. He asks what on earth she expects to achieve here. When she whispers that she just wants peace, his laughter is slow and hollow. Why would he ever want peace when the war is so beautiful and he is already winning? The camera opens on Aria. She tries to stand tall, listing the brutal damage Dante had already inflicted: 3 smoking warehouses, 12 bodies, oceans of bleeding cash. Her voice holds steady, but her hands tremble subtly in the cold light. Victor does not even blink. Assays straight through this fragile mask of authority to the terrified, desperate woman underneath. He knows this isn't about stopping the violence. It is pure, blinding devotion. She is throwing herself onto the sword for the very man who locked her in the dark. To save her captor, she offers Victor the ultimate prize: the complete, absolute destruction of Dante's life's work. It is a tragedy as old as time. We often destroy the things we love most, entirely convinced we are saving them. The silence between them stretches out, heavy and suffocating. Slowly, her trembling fingers slide a single folded piece of paper across the cold metal table. $30 million. Dante had given her his off-wall credentials to keep her safe, a fatal crack in his armor, born of twisted love. Victor's face remains utterly carved from stone, but under the harsh fluorescent glare, his pupils swallow his irises. Pure, starving predatory hunger. She looks him dead in the eye, tragically believing she is buying a bloodless peace. She thinks taking Dante's fangs will keep the wolves from tearing his throat out. But the hard truth of the world is that weakness never buys mercy from a monster. A predator like Victor does not leave survivors. He only leaves bones. Let's look at this scene together, you and I. Arya is bargaining for Dante's breath, demanding total amnesty in exchange for his kingdom. In the background, tourists snap joyful photos, entirely blind to the invisible blood spilling right beside them. Victor leans in, his voice dropping to a velvet whisper, slicing right into her deepest wound. He warns her Dante will never forgive this ultimate betrayal. And the tragedy? She accepts that emotional death sentence. She will let Dante hate her forever, just so he stays alive. Victor slides the paper into his dark coat, his eyes dancing with cruel amusement. When she begs for his word, he gives a single, hollow nod. It reminds us that blind faith, placed in the hands of the wicked, is just another form of self-destruction. The shadows seem to lengthen as Victor delivers his final, agonizing threat. He promises to make the execution slow, specifically forcing Dante to watch the light leave her eyes. Before fading into the crowd, he drops a poisonous whisper, reminding her she is throwing her life away for a man who only ever took from her. The bitter truth hangs heavy in the air. The moment Victor vanishes, the adrenaline abandons her completely. Arya collapses against the cold brick wall, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. She has just sold out the devil she loves, fully convinced this monumental betrayal is an act of pure grace. Sometimes, the most catastrophic mistakes we make in life are the ones we commit with the most absolute, devastatingly good intentions. In the suffocating back seat of the car, the harsh glow of her phone paints her pale face. 17 missed calls, 32 frantic messages. Dante's iron grip on the world is slipping. She cannot bear to read his desperation, so she dials his men. Hearing that Dante's cameras caught her meeting his enemy, a terrifying, ghostly calm washes over her. She simply orders them to take her home. The air in the vehicle is thick enough to choke on. The armed guards look at her like a live grenade, terrified of the blast radius. When they pull up to the estate, the massive front doors are hanging wide open in the dark. It is a stark, quiet reminder that the walls we build to protect ourselves almost never keep the real, inevitable danger from walking right inside. She steps into the cavernous living room and finds a king reduced to ash. Dante looks 10 years older, his eyes are deadened, and his jaw works furiously under the strain. His immaculate suit is ruined with dark patches of dried blood, his legendary control completely shattered. With a terrifyingly soft whisper, he orders his guards out. You and I might wonder how long it would take a man like him to uncover the treason. The answer is instantly. He begs her to deny it, his voice breaking, desperate to hold on to the illusion of her loyalty. But the moment she confesses, his grief turns to ice. He watched his accounts drain in real time the second she met Victor. The bitter lesson here is that trust, once broken, shatters so thoroughly that no amount of love can ever sweep the pieces back together. The crushing weight of her naivety finally crashes down. Dante lays it bare. $30 million gone. 15 brutal years of empire building wiped off the map in a handful of minutes. Arya weakly stammers that Victor promised peace. Dante explodes, hurling a heavy lamp against the plaster, a raw burst of sheer, terrifying helplessness. Victor had already called him, mocking him, promising to slaughter his men with the very money she handed over. Aria's knees buckle. She stumbles, her entire reality shattering, as she repeats, "He promised." Dante's laughter echoes through the shadows, a broken, horrifying sound of total defeat. It is a haunting reminder that feeding a starving beast will never tame it. It only gives the monster the strength it needs to finally consume you. The air in the room turns to frost as the bond snaps forever. Dante looks at the woman he bled for and states plainly, her mercy was a murder weapon. He points to the door, ordering her out of his house, out of his life. She shakes her head, refusing to let the twisted love story die. But when he turns to face her, the man she knew is gone. His eyes are empty black glass. He lists her sins in a dead, flat tone. The ruin, the betrayal, the sheer arrogance of thinking she could outplay the devil. Love is a profound force, but we must remember it requires wisdom. Her frantic need to fix everything, her absolute inability to simply wait in the dark and trust him, is exactly what brought the roof crashing down on them. Dante cuts straight through her tears to the ugly truth. He sees that this wasn't just about saving him. It was her desperate clawing for control. She needed to feel powerful in a dark world that kept her in a cage. But by trying to outsmart a monster like Victor, she burned Dante's kingdom to ash. "Stay with me here." This is the heartbreaking climax. He doesn't scream. He simply starts counting backwards from 60. A chilling, mechanical countdown echoing in the grand, empty room. The cold reality finally hits her bones. She broke the man she worshipped. Her legs barely support her weight as she drags herself toward the heavy oak door. She chokes out one last apology, met only by his silent, suffocating regret. The hardest lesson we ever learn is that love does not always conquer. Sometimes it ruins everything. The heavy thud of the front door closing behind her sounds like a tomb sealing shut. Outside, the midday sun is blindingly bright, mocking the absolute darkness expanding in her chest. Marco, his face completely blank, guides her to a waiting car. Her sanctuary is gone. He hides her away in a cheap, anonymous hotel room, paying in untraceable cash, and leaves her to the silence. Left completely alone, the dam finally breaks. Aria collapses onto the stained carpeting, her body tearing itself apart with agonizing, guttural sobs. For 2 days, she refuses to eat or sleep, staring blankly at the flickering television as the news reports the bloody street war she unleashed. We must accept that we cannot outrun the consequences of our choices. Eventually, the ghosts we create will always find our door. Across the city, Victor moves like a plague, wiping out Dante's men with the precision of a starving wolf. Dante fights back, but it is a doomed, bloody crawl. On the 3rd day of Aria's isolation, the hotel door swings open. Marco walks in, his eyes dark, holding out a phone. "You and I need to truly grasp the weight of what happens next." Dante, a king who built his empire on absolute silence, has walked into the federal light. He confesses to everything. The blood, the money, the rot. He hands them the nails for his own coffin, guaranteeing he will die in a concrete cell. But this is not redemption. It is a devastating, calculated final strike to drag Victor down into the flames with him. Sometimes, the only way to finally kill the devil is to lock the doors and set your own house on fire. There, the camera lingers on Marco's shadowed face as he details the scorched earth strategy. Dante was feeding his legacy to the flames, burning his empire so Victor would inherit a kingdom of ashes. In the dim light, Aria's trembling hands reveal her failure to grasp such devastating spite. Dante accepted a life in a cold cell to starve his enemy. When Aria's fractured heart begged for one last look at the man who broke her, Marco's flat denial hung heavy in the quiet room, A thick envelope sat on the desk, her forced ticket to Los Angeles. You and I must pause here, in the shadows of this tragedy, to understand a simple truth. You cannot cure a predator with affection. Sometimes, the only way to survive a monster is to turn your back and walk away. Let the lens focus on the heavy parchment in Aria's still hands. The cash inside is a masterstroke of control, disguised as a lover's final act of grace. Her eyes map the ink, wide and hollow, her shallow breaths echoing in the empty room. Dante's letter, read like funeral dirge, he spins his surrender to federal agents into a noble sacrifice. Whispering from the pages that ultimate power only guarantees an isolated death, he tore down his syndicate to leave Victor starving. But the true tragedy lies in the invisible chains he wraps around Aria's throat. By playing the martyr, he ensures her soul remains tethered to his ghost. It is a quiet, brutal lesson. The most dangerous cages are never made of iron, but of misplaced gratitude and a tragic, unyielding devotion. The camera pushes in as a tear strikes the letter. Dante's words pivot from a hollow apology into a dark romanticization of his own poison. He crowns her a beautiful anomaly in his kingdom of ruin, tightening the snare of her devotion. He commands her to paint and step into the sunlight, framing his cruel abandonment as a king's pardon. Reading his confession of an insufficient love, Aria's chest heaves with agonizing grief. Driven by a desperate attachment, she corners Marco in the shadows. When she learns Dante waits at the Federal Transfer Center, every instinct of self-preservation shatters. We must recognize a terrifying reality. True love builds a steady foundation, but toxic attachment builds a pyre, blinding us until we leap willingly into the flames. Step with me into the oppressive concrete architecture of the federal facility. You and I can almost feel the chill radiating from the walls. Aria's desperate need to face him is a tragic portrait of a moth drawn to an inferno. The heavy steel door groans open, and Dante steps into the harsh fluorescent light. Vivid bruising on his face, and a dull uniform stand in brutal contrast to his former glory. Yet his dark eyes remain predatory. He sits across the metal table, wrapping himself in suffocating silence, forcing her to carry the agonizing weight of the reunion. It is a chilling reminder of a harsh truth. True power is rarely loud. Most often, it is found in the one who holds their silence, making the other person bleed out just to fill the empty room. The silence shatters as Aria's voice trembles, accusing him of throwing his life away. Dante's response is an icy blade. A 20-year sentence, he murmurs, is infinitely superior to a grave. Her breath hitches, chest tight with panic. Screaming that he is playing God with her reality, he does not flinch. He calls his absolute control, the only way to keep her breathing. He watches a tear fall and coldly dissects her past betrayal, explaining how her rebellion only painted a target on her back. By burning his empire to ash, he erased the danger, leaving her permanently chained to his memory. Here lies a devastating truth. The people who loudly claim to protect us are sometimes just building a safer, more elaborate prison, making absolutely certain they are the only ones holding the key. In measured tones, Dante lays out the architecture of her exile: fake papers, clean money, a ghost life in Los Angeles. Aria shatters, her sobs echoing against the concrete as she begs to wait for him. Dante's gaze is heavy, yet entirely ruthless. He diagnoses her loyalty as a sickness, labeling her willingness to throw away 20 years as just another cage. Yet, he twists the knife, weaponizing his love to force her departure. The agony twisting her features is unbearable as she fights his decree. It is a horrific testament to the iron chains of trauma. It reminds us that true love should never demand the surrender of your own soul. When we mistake deep manipulation for romance, we willingly sacrifice our beautiful, fleeting existence just to keep the fading ghost of a monster company. Watch the shift in Arya's tear-stained face. In the harsh glare, the camera catches a fleeting tremor in Dante's jaw, a flicker of suppressed ruin. For one heartbeat, the fog in Arya's mind clears. She realizes that worshipping his memory will only turn her into a ghost. Anger ignites as she spits venom at his fake nobility. But Dante, chained to the table, strips away the illusion with precision. He confesses his darkest sin. This is not about her safety. He is freezing her in amber to satisfy his own selfish craving. He severs the cord so she will not decay into collateral damage, completely stealing her right to choose. Here is a bitter pill we must all swallow. No one ever has a right to rewrite your life story just to make themselves the tragic hero of their own narrative. Dante's voice drops to a whisper. He can endure decades of rot, but watching her destroyed, that is his absolute limit. Arya's body shakes, tears spilling as she mocks the mundane life he expects of her, painting canvases, finding a safe lover, turning grey. Dante's eyes soften in a rare display of truth. He commands her to step into the light. When she asks if he will choke on regret, his soft reply is a masterstroke, keeping his hooks in her heart while pushing her away. A guard's heavy hand falls on his shoulder. The visit is over. Rising, Dante murmurs a quiet word of thanks, perfectly sealing her tragic fate. This moment reminds us of a dark but necessary lesson. The softest, most romantic words can often forge the heaviest, most unbreakable chains we will ever wear. Before the doors closed, Dante breathes out his gratitude. He thanks her for tearing through the ice of his soul, crediting her love for his rebirth. Through her weeping, Arya confesses that his dark obsession was the fire that made her real. Dante offers a fleeting vision of a life where they could be normal. But Arya's smile is a broken curve. She knows that removing their shared trauma would erase the very spark binding them. The heavy door slams. Stepping out into the biting Chicago wind, she finds Marco waiting by a black sedan. Looking at the violent city that shattered her, she accepts her gilded cage and the long exile to Los Angeles. This moment demands we accept a bitter, necessary truth about survival. You can never truly heal in the exact same place that broke you to pieces. Look closely as the final illusion shatters. In a dim hotel room, a decrypted message washes over Arya's pale face, revealing Dante's terrifying foresight. The secrets she risked everything to leak were all fake. He had predicted her betrayal, playing on her savior complex to feed her a lie. He stole her agency, making her rebellion meaningless, yet praised her for trying. The sheer scale of his manipulation crushes her. Her defenses snap. She drops to the floor, spiraling into breathless, manic laughter that echoes off the cheap wallpaper. She is forever trapped in the labyrinth of his mind. Here is a haunting lesson for you and me. The darkest betrayals do not come from enemies with weapons, but from those who turn our own empathy into a permanent, inescapable trap. Her laughter breaks down into profound weeping. Her body understands what her mind cannot bear. He played the villain just to save her from her own compassion. The screen flashes with a second message, contradicting his cold goodbye. Dante confesses his love was always enough, and letting her go is his bloodiest sacrifice. He claims a permanent throne in her memory. Through tears, Arya whispers a vow to the empty room, promising never to let him fade. His final command demands she paint him not as a monster, but as a bleeding man. Exhausted, she drags herself to the easel, channeling her trauma into chaotic strokes of paint. It is a striking reminder of a powerful truth. Our deepest wounds often become our greatest art. Sometimes, the only way to survive immense pain is to create something immortal. The camera reveals a canvas violently divided by brilliant light and suffocating shadow, a tragic map of their romance. Arya moves like a phantom until the sun bleeds through the curtains, using the brush to stitch her nerves together. With the paint still wet, she leaves for the transit hub. The grim skyline of Chicago fades, left behind as a graveyard of her soul's dismantling. The sprawl of Los Angeles waits, offering a sterile stage for her new existence. Miles away, behind iron and stone, Dante paces his silent cell, beginning his cold adjustment. They survived the inferno, but walk away permanently rewired by their psychological infection. We leave them here with one undeniable truth. You might survive a shattered heart, but you will never again be the exact same person you were before the break. The camera opens on a bleak, cramped apartment in Los Angeles, the harsh afternoon sun cutting across the dust motes. We see Arya trying to survive the sheer, deafening quiet of her new reality. To her, framing this deep trauma as some tragic, unconventional romance is the only way to keep her lungs pulling in air. It is a brilliant, desperate trick of the mind. She begins walking the sun-baked concrete until her heels bleed, watching strangers in diners, trying to remember how normal people sit, how they breathe. The silence of the room finally pushes her to a breaking point. By the end of the first week, she needs a way to bleed the poison out, driving her to buy a stack of blank canvases. Our minds will always find a way to protect us, even if it means painting a monster in the softest light. Picture the stark lighting of a solitary bulb swinging over a makeshift studio. The smell of turpentine hangs heavy in the air. For 3 agonizing days, Arya just stares at the blank canvas, completely paralyzed. When the brush finally hits the fabric, it moves with violent, desperate strokes. But she does not paint the apex predator who shattered her life. The camera pushes in close on the canvas, revealing a tragically idealized Dante, the broken boy she desperately wanted to save, the captor who finally let her go. She captures the agonizing fracture of his soul. When she finally hangs the wet portrait on the wall, her knees buckle and a raw, guttural sob rips from her chest. We often cling to the softest versions of the people who hurt us most, simply because the brutal truth is too heavy to carry alone. Let us look closely at how survival actually plays out on screen. You and I know that trauma demands an outlet. Arya spends her nights painting the cold architecture of her nightmare, the shadowed restaurant, the suffocating house, the dark, churning water where everything went wrong. She takes her silent, screaming terror and traps it in oil and pigment. A month into this brutal routine, she takes a quiet job at a local art gallery, hiding behind a receptionist's desk just to feel the rhythm of ordinary time. But the gallery director, an older woman with sharp eyes, takes one look at her portfolio and immediately spots the terrified girl running for her life beneath the brushstrokes. Here is a truth we all eventually learn. Survival is never about magically erasing your scars, but rather discovering exactly how to use them. The frame rests on Carmen, her new boss, staring at the canvases and realizing the paint is practically screaming off the walls. For 3 long months, Arya manages to hold together a fragile, paper-thin illusion of a normal life. Then comes the inevitable cinematic pivot, 2 a.m. The harsh, metallic ringing of a phone cuts through the darkness. It is Sarah Chen, a federal prosecutor calling from a freezing Chicago office. The very second she speaks Dante's name, watch the way the blood physically drains from Arya's face. Her breath catches. Her hands begin to tremble against the receiver. It teaches a harsh truth that geography can never cure a broken spirit. You can pack your bags, change your name, and flee to the very edge of the map, but you can never escape the architecture of your own mind. Notice the tragic, almost unbearable tension in her body. Her first terrified whisper into the phone is not a question about her own safety, but a desperate plea to know if the man who destroyed her is safe. The prosecutor pushes hard, demanding her help to finally crush Dante's syndicate. But Aria just stares across the dimly lit room at that massive, haunting portrait of him. She shakes her head, tears spilling hot down her cheeks, rationalizing that he was the one who ultimately spared her life. She would rather burn her own future than to testify against the ghost she still loves. It breaks your heart to watch, but it teaches a vital lesson. The most inescapable, insidious prisons in this world are never constructed with iron bars, but with the misplaced, desperate gratitude toward those who originally held the key. The prosecutor tries logic, listing the innocent lives ruined by the syndicate, but trauma bonds are utterly deaf to reason. Then the camera cuts to the cold, concrete reality of a maximum security cell. Dante, even behind reinforced glass, still holds the strings. He sends a chillingly calculated message through an associate, whispering that her testimony would not be a betrayal, but an act of profound truth. He plays her like a tragic violin. He knows the exact emotional pitch required to make her submit. Realizing the invisible chain around her throat is tighter than ever, she immediately caves, but she demands terms. She negotiates not for police protection, but to shave years off the sentence of the man who broke her. The people who study our hearts the closest are always the ones who know exactly how to break them. When the government refuses to guarantee his safety, the walls of the tiny apartment seem to physically close in on her. She is drowning in panic. She grabs the phone and dials Carmen, the camera lingering on her white-knuckled grip. Her voice cracks as she confesses a desperate, clawing need to just be normal, to bury the nightmare under a thick layer of California sand. But she whispers the terrifying truth. He is in her blood. He dictates his brushstrokes, her waking thoughts, the very rhythm of her heart. We watch her slowly realize that simply hiding from the darkness is a fool's errand. It is a necessary observation for our own quiet struggles. We burn exhausting amounts of energy trying to bury our ugly histories, forgetting that buried pain never simply vanishes into the earth. It only mutates in the dark. Aria finally speaks the bitter truth out loud. She fled thousands of miles, yet the ghost of that man occupies every inch of her mind. Let us pause here, because you and I can learn something profound from how Carmen handles this. She does not pity Aria. Instead, she looks her right in the eye and strips away the illusion. She reminds her that the deepest human bonds are never polite or neat. They are chaotic, bloody, and entirely destructive. Carmen asks the only question that matters. Can you truly live with this suffocating silence for the rest of your life? The camera lingers on Aria's trembling jaw as the reality sets in. The foundational truth of this story is universal. Running away only delays the inevitable collision with your own soul. 2 weeks later, the roar of jet engines carries her back to Chicago. Stepping onto the cold tarmac in Chicago hits like a physical blow. The skyline is exactly the same, heavy with brutal memories, but the camera captures a new, steel-like resolve in her eyes. The terrified runaway is dead. She walks through the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse with her spine perfectly straight. On the witness stand, she strips away every ounce of emotion. delivering cold, hard facts as the prosecutor dissects the criminal empire piece by piece. Desperate, the defense attorneys unleash a brutal counterattack, pacing the floor, trying to paint her not as a survivor, but as a scorned, unstable lover out for cheap revenge. It is an ugly tactic, but it reminds us that when we finally find the courage to face our darkest history, others will always try to twist our narrative for their own gain. The defense attorney leans in close, his voice dripping with venom, accusing her of calculatingly selling Dante out to a rival cartel. The courtroom holds its collective breath. The camera pushes in tight on Aria's face, catching the tragic, paradoxical logic of a broken heart. Her voice is barely above a whisper, yet it echoes off the wood-paneled walls. She admits the betrayal, confessing she shattered his empire solely to save him from a violent death. She knew his monumental ego was marching him toward a shallow grave, so she pulled the trigger on his legacy to keep his hearting. It is a chilling, beautiful moment of absolute vulnerability. This proves how deeply trauma entirely warps our protective instincts, making us destroy the very things we love just to keep them breathing. That single, shattered confession hangs in the air, instantly suffocating the defense's entire strategy. The jury sees her not as a vindictive mastermind, but as a girl profoundly scarred by a world built on violence and want control. A cinematic montage carries us through 3 grueling weeks of testimony. Day after day, she sits beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, mechanically dismantling the empire. Yet, notice the deliberate framing. Not once does she look to her left. She fiercely guards her visual boundaries, knowing that a single second of eye contact with Dante would shatter her entirely. Finally, the gavel falls, locking away 15 dangerous men. The lesson here is quiet but immense. True strength does not mean you are immune to the fire. Sometimes survival simply means knowing exactly where not to look. The moment the heavy courthouse doors close behind her, the intoxicating pull of the past violently returns. A shadow from the old life approaches. Marco, quietly delivering a message that the king demands an audience. Stick with me here, because this is where the tragedy seals itself. She willfully walks through the towering metal gates of the federal penitentiary, stepping back into a cage to face the man who built her internal prison. Through the smudged glass, Dante looks physically hollowed out, yet his dark eyes radiate a terrifying, triumphant calm. He looks at her with the slow, deliberate smile of a predator whose math was absolutely flawless. She secured his 8-year sentence. He won. It teaches us a haunting truth about toxic bonds. Some chains are never truly broken. They are merely rearranged in the dark. Let us step into this suffocating room together. Aria's posture is rigid, demanding the true purpose of his summons. The shadows seem to bend toward Dante as he speaks. His voice is a velvet trap, a calculated deployment of validation. He praises her devotion to truth, a bitter irony from a man built entirely on lies. The stark light catches the sharp angle of his jaw as he reveals the depth of his surveillance. He has been watching her art, knowing he remains the dark sun she orbits. He tells her to keep painting him, styling himself a tragic muse rather than the monster he is. It is a terrifying lesson regarding the ego. Even stripped of a physical empire, the narcissist will always claw through the dirt to remain the absolute center of your universe. Aria's eyes narrow as she challenges his motives, searching the cold glass between them for any sign of deception. Dante does not flinch. With the effortless grace of a sociopath, he reframes his incarceration. He paints his iron cage not as a punishment for a lifetime of violence, but as a tragic romantic obstacle to their souls. The camera lingers on his hands as he offers the classic illusion of choice. He will not demand her loyalty for 8 years, yet he weaves his words to ensure she can never cut the cord. Arya's shoulders drop. She willfully accepts the chains, bracing for the inevitable scorn of the outside world. But the lesson of true captivity is blindingly simple. When the trauma bond is forged deep enough in the dark, the noise of the outside world fades to absolute nothingness. The camera pushes in on Arya's face, her expression a haunting mask of emotional blunting. When warned of the psychological ruin waiting for her, she offers only a dark nod. The tragic endpoint of prolonged Stockholm Syndrome. They spend their allotted hour normalizing the bizarre. Dante speaks of his prison routine, his sudden appetite for philosophy. Notice the terrifying irony. The apex predator is now studying the societal constructs he once burned to the ground. Arya leans closer, her voice soft but insistent, correcting his isolation by promising to visit. She commits to the rhythm of her own captivity. It teaches us a deeply grim reality in this life. Some wounds do not heal at all. They simply become your daily routine. Listen to the tremor in her voice as she promises to keep painting his face, pouring her obsession onto the canvas. Dante absorbs this with quiet hunger, accepting his avenue to immortality. A narcissist always requires an audience, and she just volunteered to be his permanent gallery. She bypasses the memory of his monstrous past, offering a raw confession of love. Dante mirrors her perfectly. He lowers his head, calling himself a broken man, weaponizing his vulnerability to keep her protective instincts bleeding for him. She retreats before her tears can fall. Later, in the sterile light of the airport transit, Marco offers a chilling observation. He claims Dante's neural pathways have physically altered. The lesson is undeniable. A relentless, obsessive love can rewrite the mind of a monster. You and I must pause here and look closely at the tragedy. Marco truly believed her devotion had neutralized Dante's self-destructive pathology. Back in her sunlit California isolation, the clinical reality of Arya's behavior began to shift. The canvases still bled with traumatic origins, but a strange cognitive integration was taking shape. 6 months after the trial, she put her visual case studies on public display. One sharp-eyed critic saw right through the paint. They noted it was not a portrait of a healthy romance, but a brutal documentation of pure recognition. It leaves us with a haunting final lesson for our own lives. Sometimes, survival simply means learning to paint the monsters that live inside your head. The lens focuses sharply on Arya, her artwork serving as a vivid manifestation of her trauma. 3 pieces sold, not enough to buy true independence, but enough to validate her distorted reality. She mails the photographic proof to Dante. His reply arrives on cheap penitentiary paper, yet his penmanship remains terrifyingly controlled. He writes of his pride, asking how it felt to sell their history for $3,000. Her written response is textbook Stockholm Syndrome. She calls him a miracle, thanking the very architect of her ruin for pulling her back to humanity. She tells him she needed his cage to finally feel free. The tragic loop continues. The hardest lesson to learn is how easily a broken heart will confuse heavy iron chains with the warmth of true safety. The rhythm of their letters becomes a slow drip of intermittent reinforcement, a heartbeat once a month. They dance around the blood-stained past, projecting their minds into a fabricated future. 12 months pass in this agonizing suspension. Then, Dante uses a monitored call to shatter the calm. He announces a sudden transfer to a minimum security prison in California, framing it as a choice that depends entirely on her. We can almost hear the violent spike in Arya's chest. He lets a heavy, calculated silence fall before setting the final psychological hook. He whispers that this move places him physically closer to her if she truly wants it. Naturally, she gasps out a yes. The lesson here is brutal. A trauma bond will always force you to beg for the very poison that is killing you. Stick with me. This is where the tension becomes unbearable. Dante warns her that his proximity will tear her life apart. But Arya leans directly into the fire, a classic trauma response. Dante offers a low, practiced laugh, claiming he simply missed the sound of her voice. March arrives. The new facility sits 3 hours north of Los Angeles. Arya walks into the visiting room, her body vibrating between sheer terror and blinding euphoria. There is no reinforced glass here, only an open table forcing unfiltered, raw contact. Dante looks disarmingly genuine, his overt pathology seemingly washed away. They sit across from each other, entirely motionless. No words, just a heavy, suffocating visual hunger. Remember this vital truth. Silence is often the loudest symptom of a desperate dependency. Watch closely as the fallen king recalibrates his dominance in a powerless room. He greets her with a calculated simplicity. Arya speaks of Los Angeles as a chaotic sanctuary, a place where her ghosts cannot find her. They fall into a deep dialogue about her art and his education. As the clock ticks down, Dante initiates a deliberate physical strike. He reaches out, moving slowly to allow a flight response, but she remains perfectly still. His fingers trace her skin. He whispers that he has 7 years left. Then he strips himself bare, confessing he has no empire, no soldiers waiting in the dark. His grip tightens on her hand. The lesson is profound. True power is not but the ability to hold another soul entirely hostage with nothing but a single touch. The camera catches the subtle tremor in Dante's jaw as he fabricates an identity crisis. He questions if this shattered version of himself can truly sustain her love without the dark glamour of the cartel. Arya scrambles to reinforce the trauma bond, practically begging him to believe her paintings prove her devotion. He leans in, warning her that she is obsessed with a ghost, a mere projection of his former self. She swallows the danger, blindly committing to this cognitive restructuring. He flashes a devastating, vulnerable smile, asking softly if she will wait. She claims to be building an independent career, yet her soul is entirely tethered to his release date. It is a heartbreaking truth we all must face. Love alone is never enough to cure the rot of a deeply poisoned foundation. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Arya finally confesses her own lack of self-worth. She looks into his eyes and sees 2 catastrophic failures clinging to the wreckage of rehabilitation. To the clinical eye, this is a tragedy. 2 fractured psyches using each other's bleeding edges to simulate balance. As the years bleed by, Arya's external life flourishes. Her artistic profile explodes, bringing high-profile buyers. Yet behind the gallery lights, Dante remains the heavy iron anchor tied to her ankle. Her paintings swing violently between intense trauma and naive hope. Critics praise her work as brutally optimistic. She smiles for the cameras, entirely unaware of the lesson written in her own paint. You can never build true success while secretly living inside a simulation of your own captivity. You and I are going to unpack this final sequence together. Watch his terrifying behavioral adaptation. By year 3, Dante secures his academic credentials. By year 4, he morphs into a mentor, the classic pivot of a megalomaniac, finding a new hierarchy to conquer. By year 5, his compliance earns an early parole date. On a cold December morning, Marco calls to announce Dante will walk free in April. The camera spirals as Arya collapses among her canvases. Marco explains that Dante sent him to deliver the news, offering her the illusion of a clean escape. Arya stares at her paint-stained hands, scanning the independent life she built from the ashes. Here is the ultimate life lesson. Freedom is the most terrifying thing in the world when the dark warmth of a cage is all you truly know. The harsh neon of a cheap motel casts heavy shadows across Arya's exhausted face. She truly believed she no longer needed her former captor to breathe, but the tragic tether of her trauma held firm. She wanted him back, rationalizing this dark pull as a shared survival tactic rather than a plea for rescue. Perhaps the hardest lesson in life is that we often crave the very fire that burned us. She ordered Marco to ensure she stood right at the exit, her voice cold with terrifying certainty. For 90 sleepless days, her manic anticipation bled onto her canvases. She painted a collection named Redemption, showing shattered souls clawing toward the light. Now, on April 14th, parked near the penitentiary walls, the severe lack of sleep felt like a suffocating physical weight. The bright morning of April 15th feels completely at odds with the tragic gravity of the scene. Arya stands frozen outside the perimeter, every nerve misfiring in silent panic. At 8:30, the heavy steel gates retract. Dante steps out in simple denim and a white shirt. The sight of this fallen king stepping into the light dominates the frame. He blinks hard against the sun, briefly overwhelmed. Then, his dark eyes lock onto his anchor. Across the cracked asphalt, the air thickens. He crosses the gap with brutal speed, and Arya meets him halfway. His hands forcefully capture her face, pulling her into a desperate forehead press to assert his dominance. It teaches us a profound lesson. Sometimes, true surrender is a willing choice made out of unyielding devotion. She whispered her validation of his return. In a choked whisper, Arya confessed she could not believe he was free until she saw it. Their desperate physical connection flooded her brain with dopamine, sealing a tragic 6-year loop of trauma. When they finally pulled apart, the emotional whiplash was violent. They were laughing through bitter tears, completely unhinged. Dante admitted he had no idea how to exist out here. No job, no plan, no understanding of normal society. Arya smiled at this, openly predicting they would crash and burn together. It shows us that shared brokenness is often the strongest glue between two people. They proudly called themselves a beautiful disaster. Nearby, Marco waited by the car, keeping a submissive distance. Slowly, Arya stepped back just enough to truly look at the megalomaniac she had waited for. Stick with me, this is where their bond gets truly fascinating. Arya softly asked what he wanted to do first as a free man. True to his dark nature, Dante only wanted to see the monuments she had built in his honor. He demanded to view the entire archive of her obsession. When she nervously warned him that every painting was just him, a slow smile touched his lips. That was exactly what he craved. We all secretly want to be the center of someone's universe, even if it destroys them. As Marco drove them toward Los Angeles, Dante kept a tight, desperate grip on her in the back seat. He was hyper-vigilant, constantly touching her face to prove she was real. They finally arrived at her massive industrial warehouse. When she unlocked the heavy metal door and guided him inside, the fallen king simply stopped breathing. The camera pulls back to reveal massive walls covered by 72 months of feverish obsession. Every canvas was a timeline of their trauma painted in violent pigment. A dark man faking empathy, and a broken woman finally feeling seen. Dante walked the perimeter with slow, heavy steps, absorbing his own godhood. For 15 agonizing minutes, the room was dead silent. He just stared. Then, the emotional dam broke. Tears actually spilled from his hardened eyes. He turned to her, his voice cracking as he whispered that she made his monstrous nature look beautiful. He had spent his life destroying everything he touched, yet she had rebuilt his soul on canvas. The lesson here is that pure devotion can rewrite even our darkest histories. He pulled her flush against his chest and, in a raw whisper, swore his eternal love to her. Dante traced his dark obsession back to that night with the shattered glass. Her cold detachment had been irresistible to his predatory soul. Now, he promised to become the man she painted. Aria stroked his face, cementing their bond by swearing his mere existence was enough. They stood wrapped in their beautiful delusion, twisting past trauma into salvation. But stepping back into reality was predictably brutal. Life teaches us that leaving a cage never erases the deep scars of being caged. Dante's nervous system was still at war. He jolted at every shadow, needing constant noise just to sleep. Stripped of his underworld empire, a heavy depression consumed him. Yet he fought back. He took a quiet job at a small bookshop, moved into a tiny apartment, and subjected himself to exhausting, rigorous psychoanalytic therapy to heal. You and I know recovery is never linear. The climb out of darkness is always painful. Aria fought her own deep demons. She held her breath daily, terrified the old, violent Dante would return. Her peers abandoned her, disgusted by her toxic loyalty, leaving her utterly isolated. She had to swallow the frantic urge to manage his dark moods. Slowly, through fractured conversations, they rewired their broken habits. A year later, Dante stepped into her studio with a rare light in his eyes. He had been accepted into a graduate literature program with full funding. Yet, his voice actually shook. He felt too old, too scarred to sit among normal students. Aria grabbed his shoulders, fiercely reminding him that a man who survived max security could easily survive a classroom. The pathology lingered, but they were finally writing a new story. You and I have probably witnessed how the most broken bonds can harden into a strange peace. 2 years later, their tragic merger was on full display. The camera pans across a gallery in New York. Aria secured a massive solo exhibition, a triumph quietly funded and protected by Dante's lingering shadow. Standing together under the gallery lights, she leaned into his chest. She credited their shared chaos for her beautiful art, swearing they built this success together. It teaches us that sometimes true survival means absorbing the poison until it becomes part of your blood. She had not merely escaped the narcissist, she had woven his darkness perfectly into her own identity. The integration was absolute. They were thriving, happily functioning inside a beautifully painted cage of their own making. Let's look closely at where they landed. They were not miraculously healed, as trauma leaves permanent scars, but they functioned. 3 years after his release, Dante proposed at 2 a.m. in her studio. "Marry me," he murmured. There was none of the terrifying arrogance I usually observed in syndicate leaders. He wasn't staking a claim. He was offering a realistic, broken partnership. Aria laughed, wiping tears away as she called it the worst proposal ever. But she eagerly accepted. The wedding lacked any dark, sociopathic pageantry, just Marco, Carmen, and a few quiet witnesses. You and I must understand this profound lesson. True recovery is never the absolute absence of trauma. It is simply the daily, stubborn decision to build a life in spite of it. The camera frames them in the sweeping desert, outside the heavy prison walls where Dante's rehabilitation began. Their vows felt like a fierce psychological contract. I promise to see you, Arya whispered, swearing to anchor him when depression swallowed him. Dante's response was deeply diagnostic. I promise to let you be visible, he replied, vowing to abandon the manipulative monster he used to be. He promised to be worthy of the woman who saw the broken man beneath the pathology. The vital lesson here is that true devotion can shatter our deepest mental chains. I once viewed her purely through the agonizing lens of Stockholm's room, much like Luca's pain, but Arya rewrote their tragic script. They became mutual redemption. Soon after, Dante secured his degree and began teaching at a community college. Arya's artwork conquered galleries in London, Tokyo, and Paris. They bought a quiet home in Silver Lake. But healing is never a straight line. Dante still woke up shivering from acute night terrors, while Arya battled the cognitive dissonance of loving a former criminal. They argued over beautifully normal things, unwashed dishes, broken appliances, and tight schedules. Yet, they successfully built a healthy life. 10 years after that broken glass shattered their worlds, the camera finds them resting on their porch. Dante was grading academic papers while Arya sketched his face. She softly told him they were living empirical proof that a monster can learn to be human. The profound lesson here is undeniable. The raw vulnerability of truly being seen is always worth the terrifying risk of emotional pain. Look at us, Arya murmured. You transitioned from crime boss to professor. I went from invisible waitress to artist. She wondered if they had become entirely new people. Dante challenged her. Or are we just the same people who learned to be honest about who we were? It was a stunning moment of self-actualization, completely free of the denial usually found in criminal minds. Arya accepted this dual reality. Dante pulled her close, admitting he was deeply grateful she dropped that glass. He knew the resulting trauma was the fire needed to burn away the artificial performance of their pasts. She kissed him, offering a grounded, highly rational declaration of love for Dante Varelli. Life teaches us this final truth. Real love never hides our deep darkness. It simply and bravely holds a light to it. The room's light melts into a bruised, fragile gold. He looks at her, exhaustion softening around his eyes. I love you too, Bennett Varelli, whispers heavy with devotion. Artist, stubborn disaster, woman who taught me what it means to be human. Watch how the rigid tension bleeds from her shoulders. You and I have seen them navigate absolute darkness, outlasting severe trauma and psychological cages that destroy most people. Their path was never a clean escape. It required immense, painful restructuring built on shattered pieces. Yet, as the frame pulls back on their shared silence, it leaves us with a grounding truth for our own lives. An authentic, fiercely earned existence is always enough. Those hard-won scars are the only baseline that matters.